Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk about the question of whether computers can create art. First, a little bit about myself. My background is a combination of painting and computer science. So I've studied art in undergraduate, and I work as a computer scientist, but a lot of my research has been about algorithms for creating artistic images, like through painting and drawing styles. We've seen in the past few years that AI-based art has become popular and well known in the public. I think the Deep Dreams method was kind of the first method to sort of make a popular splash. And then neural style transfer methods became very popular and implemented in popular apps and Facebook video streaming. And now we're seeing this explosion of different uses of AI software to create artistic media of different kinds, such as neural network generated movie script and AI generated band names and neural network generated knitting patterns. And these things are starting to become appreciated in the fine art world too. There was the first show that I saw using neural networks was in 2016. And since then, we've seen some fairly significant artists exploring or experimenting with neural networks in various ways, such as big names like Trevor Paglen, who's a MacArthur Fellow, or Gillian Wearing, who was known as one of the young British artists. And it's made itself known in the popular culture in other ways.
I like it. It's really cool. So who painted it?
A machine. It's actually the first work of art made by AI to be sold at Sotheby's.
So that was Silicon Valley in May 2018. And then about 6 months later, an AI-generated piece of art was auctioned at Christie's for $500,000. And they even signed it with the GAN loss function, which is part of how this is created. And within the academic literature, there's also some fairly strong claims that have been made in the past. For example, in one paper, the abstract says we propose a system for generating art. The system generates art by looking at art and learning about style and becomes creative. So these are fairly strong statements, I would say, and I'm not sure the authors would necessarily defend this. Maybe we'll see tomorrow. But these are the kinds of things that are sometimes being claimed. These statements then end up in the media. So we see articles in newspapers or magazines, artificial intelligent painters invent new styles of art. Or going down the food chain, the Daily Mail says that AI artist creates its own painting style and critics prefer some of its work to human efforts. And this kind of anthropomorphic talk of the descriptions of AI software gets picked up in lots of different ways. So here's Jerry Salt, who's one of the preeminent art critics in the world.
Initial thoughts, incredibly dull, generic, boring. The programmers are not freeing up the program. I want the robot to tap into its inner robot. Be free.
So it's not clear how serious this video is, but it's really talking about as if the computer itself is the artist, and it needs to unleash its inner creativity. So if we want to ask this question for real, can computers create art? Well, the first question is, what does it mean? What exactly is the question? This is actually a little bit of a subtle question. Sometimes people ask it, like when I talk to people about this, they ask us, it's just a question of technological capability, as if, maybe we just need a better GPU and then the computer will be good enough to be an artist. On the other hand, other people, at least informally, say, of course not. Art requires intent, it requires expression. And so computers can't be artists because they can't have these things. And there's just sort of this intuition that art is this human thing. It's like having consciousness or having a soul. And this is almost a religious point of view, I would say, even if people don't phrase it that way. It'd be nice to have a little bit more of a scientific way to think about these things. So one way to ask the question is, will we ever credit AI as the author of the artwork rather than the person who built that software or ran the software or something like that? And the main points I want to make are, first, that AI tools, like other technology, are just tools for artists. They advance the field and they empower artists. They allow artists to create new styles of art and explore new things. Second, I believe that only social agents can make art, and that right now means humans can make art. And I mean something very specific by social agents, which I'll explain later. And there are scenarios where AI could be considered artists, but these are really unlikely. These are science fiction to the point where it's almost not even worth talking about them in any sort of serious discussion. And finally, I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes or so of the talk describing some of the things that are going on in the field and some of my interpretation of what those mean aesthetically. So to provide some context, I think it's worth noting that technology has always transformed art throughout the centuries. Even if we go back to, say, the Renaissance era, the development of oil paint technologies by Van Eyck and the Northern Masters gave painters much more rich tones and lighting control than they had with fresco. It's much more flexible. They can paint in one place and move the painting somewhere else. And we saw the same thing with in the 19th century in the Impressionist era, that when paint could be put in tubes, it allowed them to go outside and really change the style of Impressionist art. But throughout the centuries, within the Western tradition, there's a long identification of the skills of the artist as both their creative capability, but also their ability to mimic reality. And there's a long thread in which the ability of the artist to make these highly realistic scenes was a uniquely artist property, something that only artists could do. And just, we are so today saturated by images in our visual culture that it's hard for us to even imagine, what would it have been like to be in a world without photographs, and then to walk into a gallery and to see such unique pictures that these reproductions of visual reality that can only be created by a certain kind of highly talented artist who's very skilled. And so the identity of the artist is highly tied up in their technical skill, not just their creativity or their visual composition. So then came along the notion of photography. So here's probably the first ever photograph taken. It was originally the domain of hobbyists and tinkers, people experimenting with chemistry. Here's the first Instagram of someone's meal. This is a picture that Daguerre took out of his window. It's a 10-minute exposure. It's probably the first photo that has a human in it. You can see, if you look in the lower left here, there's a person having his shoe shined, and probably the reason that he was photographed is he was standing still long enough for the whole exposure to be to show up in the image. Here's probably the first selfie. So initially, this is all just tinkers and hobbyists, but things really changed when Daguerre publicly described his invention. And moreover, he described it in a way, he chose not to patent it because the French government felt his invention was so important that they should buy him out. And so he described it in a way that anybody could use it, anybody could experiment with it. And so immediately this was viewed as a threat to artists, because reproducing reality was part of the identity of the artist. So the classical painter Paul Delaroche was quoted as saying, "From today, painting is dead." So what actually happened? Well, there's actually multiple roles of artists or painters. So one role of an artist was simply portraiture. So as today, people want to record images of themselves, of their ancestors, of their friends and their family. If you were extraordinarily wealthy, you have access to this kind of portraiture, but that's very rare. So for middle classes, we had silhouette portraiture, and so you can create images like this. Obviously not as nice as having a painting or a photograph. So once photography was invented, portrait studios popped up, and a lot of portrait painters had to learn the new skills, had to learn how to become photographers. But it became very popular. And this is, even though having a portrait taken still was a laborious process. You had to sit still, brace your hand to the chair. You had a neck brace so that you can stay still for 10 minutes or so to get an exposure. And nonetheless, photography took off just for this purpose. And as a result, today we have all these wonderful photos of 19th century personality. So here's the photographer Matthew Brady, as photographed by the very colorful photographer Nadar. And we have just all this richness in the photo that we may never have had a painting of him. Here's the portraits of George Sand, the French novelist, are pretty an interesting story about the artistry of the photographer. She originally was going to save some money and just went to kind of like a second-rate photographer who took this picture, and she hated this picture, which, understandably. And she's like one of the, the great thinkers and writers of her era, and it doesn't really the image doesn't really represent that. So she went to Nadar, who they spent days together. He did all of his photographic tricks, and she ended up with a portrait she was much happier with, and I think it's much better of a much better picture, basically, and in part due to the artistic skill of the photographer. So as a result, one photographer says that photography has harmed painting considerably. It has killed portraiture. So basically, photography made portrait painting mostly obsolete. So that's sort of like the more functional role of painting. But there's also this more like high art conversation that went on for many decades of whether photography was considered art, whether it should be art. The early photographers, again, were hobbyists, people experimenting. But very quickly, some photographers attempted to explore and justify their art form by adopting conventional techniques and visual styles. So here's images from one photographer who created painterly compositions with multiple exposures that reflect classical themes that you would see from sort of high art painting. Here's another picture by the same photographer. So this is kind of these old fashioned. After that, there was another trend in painting. There was a sort of more gauzy, hazy look, and so the photographers adopted that. And by the beginning of the 20th century, photography began to be recognized really as its own art form. It showed up in galleries and museums, in part because of these photographers who had their own journals, their own societies, and many decades had passed that people could start to appreciate these works as creations rather than just pressing the button on the camera. Nonetheless, there were detractors. So, for example, the poet Baudelaire wrote, "If photography is allowed to stand in for art, it will corrupt it completely, thanks to the stupidity of the multitude." So that was an earlier reaction. As the decades passed, painters had more subtle ways to respond. So Whistler wrote, "The imitator is a poor kind of creature. If the man who paints only the tree or flower or other surface he sees before him were an artist, the king of artists would be the photographer. And it is for the artist to do something beyond this." So Whistler was no longer trying, as a result of photography, he was no longer trying to create realistic paintings. He now started to think about this sort of gauzy, hazy look in his paintings. This is his famous Nocturne. And so photography is pushing him to start thinking about painting in a different way than he had before. Even beyond that, Van Gogh wrote to his brother in his pivotal year, 1888, "Accurate drawing is not the essential thing to aim at, because the reflection of reality in a mirror would not be a picture at all, no more than a photograph." So Van Gogh was pushed away from realism by photography. Munch, who's most famous for the Scream, wrote, "I have no fear of photography as long as it cannot be used in heaven or in hell. I am going to paint people who breathe, feel, love, and suffer." And several decades after photography became accepted, one of the Dadaist and Surrealist statements wrote, "Looking back in history, the invention of photography has dealt a mortal blow to the old modes of expression, in painting as well as poetry." And so essentially, it was well accepted that photography was responsible for this epochal change in what happened in modern art. So to summarize, at first, it looked like photography was a machine that automated art. It just made art for you. And many artists feared and disparaged it. They said, painting is dead. What actually happened was, it turns out that photography became a new art form with distinct properties from existing art forms. At the same time, it invigorated and pushed old art forms to explore new things. Arguably, we would not have modern art as we know it today if it were not for photography. The more functional aspects were replaced, so like portraiture and other kinds of, like, say, record keeping and surveying and architectural photography. Those were imaging. Those were all replaced with photography. And even more, image creation became much more widely available to hobbyists. That is, consumers and professionals could take photographs, and now we all have photos, the ability to take photos, and that's really transformed our world, and in some ways, in many positive ways, I would say. So one sort of development or outcome of the modern art era that followed was the notion that after that, essentially whatever an artist does can be art. So there's a long period of innovation in the concept and the notion of art in the modern art period, culminating, for example, in the this famous fountain sculpture by Duchamp, where he took a urinal and submitted it to an art gallery, which you made this very strong statement. And we've seen many other variations on this in the decades that follow. And so in this talk, I broadly want to think about art as being many different things: painting, conceptual art, music, dance, movie, theaters, novels, video games. Lots of different things are considered art. But even within the fine art world, which a lot of this discussion takes place, there is a long history of generative artwork before the use of computers to create art. So John Cage would roll dice or use I Ching to randomize poetry or music. Sol LeWitt was an important conceptual artist because he wrote down instructions for making paintings, and he said that the instructions themselves were the artwork, and then other people can execute to create those paintings. And so he was very much in a way writing simple computer programs. And in fact, it's still possible to buy a new Sol LeWitt painting today. There's a foundation that will, you have to get it removed from the old location. They will come and paint it following his instructions in a new location, and then you have a Sol LeWitt painting. From the invention of computers that could produce images in the 1960s, people began to explore them as an art form. And the early explorations were generative art, which means in generative art, you write code and it produces images, and then those images are typically what are displayed. One of the most significant computer artists in the fine art sense is Harold Cohen. He was originally a fine art painter with a conventional background in the 1960s, and his sort of approach was to write down a set of rules and then to strictly follow those rules when creating paintings. They would like trace out paths on a paper. Then he discovered Fortran and was like, "Why am I doing this all by hand?" And he started a process of writing code to produce his images, and he kept doing this over the remaining 5 decades of his life. And so the image on the right shows him in front of one of his painting machines. We created an image that is completely procedurally generated. And this, in the 1980s, provoked a lot of these discussions about whether AI software can create art, and whether his software was actually intelligent or actually an artist. And I'll come back to this more later. Computer illustration with Mac Paint and Photoshop became well known in the 80s. People like Warhol used it. Again, the questions come up: is it really art? We've seen evolutionary artwork, coming and going over the decades, such as the work of Carl Sims and Scott Draves. In each of these works, users vote on which images they like or they don't like, and then the system evolves new images or animations based on those feedback, and then produce some really wonderful results. Within the world of popular computer animation, we again see the same theme, that the best work is created as a close collaboration of artists and scientists, even though people on the outside often think, well, this is just like the computer is just doing everything. So, for example, in computer animation, in the early days of Pixar, the people who were going to go on and found it, they went to Disney and they tried to convince Disney to adopt computer animation. And they said the animators, the people who made the animation, were frightened of the computer. They thought it was going to take away their jobs. In reality, they essentially try to communicate to them that it's just a tool. It doesn't do the creativity. And in reality, the production of a computer-animated film requires an enormous amount of human labor. Just making a few seconds of film is tons of work of highly trained and skilled artists. And it's like, using these interfaces, extraordinarily skill-driven task. And that's why when you watch the credits for any film that's animated or has any computer-generated visual effects, the credits just go on and on and on and on. There's so many people involved in making these films. My own work in computer graphics research is also been focused a lot on procedural or generative techniques. So this is an image from my first SIGGRAPH paper, which I developed a system that would automatically produce a painting from a photograph. We built also an installation version of this that as you walk up to it, it'll create paintings of you and the paintings refresh over time. And this is implementing my ideas and experience about how I would create painting when I was painting before this, sort of adding big brush strokes to scope out this composition and adding more and then refining fine details. I also developed techniques that would learn styles from examples. So this is a method from 2001 that, given the pastel drawing on the upper right and the photograph in the lower left, could then produce a pastel drawing in the style of the upper right image. And again, in all of these cases, I wrote a bunch of code, I developed these algorithms, and creating these final images was this process of, essentially an artistic process of figuring out how to set up a system and adjust parameters and produce good results. So the common theme here is that all computer-generated art, all these things we call computer-generated art, is very human-made. There's always someone in the process, guiding the process, making the decisions, setting up the system, tuning parameters, and deciding what to do. And that is despite what people sometimes claim about the nature of their artwork. On the other hand, there's just been this continual hype about how AI being intelligent. From even the invention of the perceptron, which is a linear classifier trained by a heuristic algorithm. The New York Times reported that the Navy said that this is the embryo of a computer that will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious. So the claims are just out of this world. In reality, this software is not intelligent. And there's this great article by Rodney Brooks that makes this point, and part of the problem is that we use these words that mean different things. So when we talk about intelligence for ourselves, that's really different from the intelligence that computers have. But people in the lay people or people who don't know how to use, or not familiar with computers, associate with these things with being the same thing. And as a result, we have all these headlines that make that these computers sound like they are the ones doing the work, rather than artists being the one who are controlling these systems and making them do everything. One of my favorite procedural AI artists is Helena Sarin, and she's made the same analogy that, like, if you use watercolor does have a mind of its own, and you have to kind of learn to guide it and control it. It's not easy to learn to paint in watercolor, and she makes this association that controlling her GANs, her generative adversarial networks, is kind of the same thing. Here's Mario Klingemann demonstrating his process for filtering out images that his GANs have created, and sort of curating his result and his data set for the next round of training. In fact, I would actually argue that it's potentially irresponsible to call a computer an artist, or to say that we have AI artists. These days, there are many societal dangers to treating AI software as if they're actually intelligent. We see examples of algorithms being used to target at-risk groups. People say that algorithms cannot be biased, that algorithms are making decisions about policing and about people's futures, and problems in those algorithms get hidden by claiming that the AI is itself making the decisions and not the people setting up the system. And so when we call an algorithm an artist, lay people don't know the difference, I think, a lot of times. They think that is implying that the AI or the software is intelligent. It gives the wrong impression. It supports the notion of AI as being an actually intelligent thing. Now, you could argue that this is an academic conference, and what do artist statements matter? But we have been seeing a lot of cases where academic discourse leaks into the public sphere, where statements written in papers or what artists say show up in news articles, in startup pitches. And so I think I suggest we should be more careful about how we talk about these things. So all this discussion so far has been about the current state of our software, but maybe this can change. Maybe with the development of better algorithms or some new insight, we could develop computers that would justifiably be considered artists? And this is a hard question, whether this could happen.
Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
So asking whether computers will be considered artists is basically making a long-term prediction. What will future software, how will future software evolve, and how will it be judged by the art world or by the population? So this is a prediction, and I'm going to make predictions, but it's hard to make any predictions for sure. Making specific predictions is nearly impossible. So if we had gone back 60 years and asked people, what does the city of the year 2001 look like? They might say rocket cars and living on the moon and space bubbles. Go back again 60 years and ask people, what do computers of 2001 look like? They say they'll be so powerful they can compute 100 digits of pi in less than an hour, and they'll fill up only one room of your house. People have been so wrong about predictions about the future of how technology would affect it. Certainly nobody foresaw the importance of smartphones or of the internet and how much those things have changed our lives. And so we're seeing all these predictions about what AI is going to do that are just all over the place, like good or bad, or that are just, I think, completely unjustified. So we can look back at certain trends. So again, as I mentioned, Harold Cohen spent decades developing and improving his procedural artworks. And it's really interesting to see how his thought process evolved from making artwork that, the idea that he had a computer that could make art, and what his response to that was.
10 years after that, I would have said, look, the program is doing this on its own. Another 10 years on, and I would have said, the fact that the program is doing this on its own is the central issue here.
So he has a computer that is making art, and it seems to him essentially that this thing is an artist. But then what happens?
It was producing complex images of a high quality, and I could have had it go on forever without rewriting a single line of code. How much more autonomous than that can one get? Well, of course, that's exactly the point. It's virtually impossible to imagine a human being in a similar position. The human artist is modified in the act of making art. For the program to have been similarly self-modifying would have required not merely that it be capable of assessing its own output, but that it had its own modifiable worldview to provide a basis for any meaningful assessment.
So it's making high quality art over and over again, but it's always kind of doing the same thing in a way. And so this is a common pattern, I think, in a lot of people who work in the space or have thought about it, is at first you say, I made a computer that generates images. That makes it an artist. But there's something missing. It's still not quite there. And then, so he says, well, maybe if it could grow or have a worldview. But I think this is, and there are other things you could imagine that it's missing. But I just think this is a common thing where people say, well, okay, an artist is something which has this list of attributes, like, it creates nice images, it's creative, or makes surprising images. And so a computer with those things should be an artist. But then you actually build something which has those attributes, but it's still kind of human driven in some unsatisfying way. And in fact, we don't even require all these attributes for humans to be an artist. For example, children making art can be very creative, but they're not necessarily surprising in a way, or they're not professional artists. Maybe better examples. There's a lot of bad art. There's a lot of or that's just not great, but it's still art as long as humans made it. Two particular things people say that art requires intent and expression. But these are things that are easy to automate. We could just have variables in the system, which are the intent, and these things will affect the outcome in some particular way. I don't think there's any meaningful way that we can, distinguish between what a system has intent or doesn't. in a way that's really like once you build the system, you're going to still say, well, it's still not an artist. Another one response some people have to this question is to say, well, you just have to look at the definition of art and that will tell you. And that doesn't really work because current definitions of art do not make these predictions. They are attempts to describe existing practices. So when people try to come up with definitions of art, they say, here are all the different things we consider art. And then why is it that sports are not art and theater is? Or why is painting considered art and not cooking or something? They don't attempt to explain things we haven't seen before, like non-humans making art. And so they don't really hold the answer. And of course, there's also the question, there doesn't really seem to be any concise definition of art anyway. One observation, one way of saying things is that whatever an artist does can be art. And, there are problems with this statement, but for sake of argument, let's treat this as a fact. And so really the question is, what can be an artist? And so I think to really answer these questions, to make predictions, I think we need to look at the evolutionary theory of art. We have to think, why do people make art? And there's this book that I love, The Art Instinct by Dennis Dutton, which I highly recommend. Very readable, very interesting. And it's argued that we create art for the evolutionary purposes are for sharing and for gifts, for displays of fitness, for mating, for displays of social status and tribal affiliation, as well as for communication, like storytelling. And all of these functions, especially the first three, they're really about social relationships. There are things that we do to affect our social relationships, to show people how we feel about them, to show off, to express status, for mating. So they're all about social relationships. And so my hypothesis is that art can only be created by agents capable of these kinds of social relationships. That doesn't mean that all of our art is about social relationships, but the evolutionary source of it is these social relationships. And so, for example, animals are like the one non-human example we have of things that have been proposed as artists. And a lot of the discussion about whether like the chimpanzee or the elephant is making art is really about how the animal feels about the work and about like, do they see the care about the process itself? When the chimpanzee gives the gift to the trainer, is it like a gift or is it just training? On the other hand, natural processes are not considered art, conventionally. They can have all of these properties of being creative, in a sense, creative and surprising and just stunningly beautiful. And yet we don't really think of them as being artists because there's no essentially social act behind making them. There's no one with an intent, no person behind it. And I really believe that authorship and process matters in how we consider art. This is an AI artwork I have at home that I like a lot, by Tom White. And I think people who see it often, maybe they'd sort of like look at it with some interest perhaps. But when I describe how it's made, that is, it was created by optimizing the layout of a set of shapes so that popular image classification algorithms classify it as a cello with a very high probability. That's a lot more interesting. So this is an image that most classification algorithms will say with 99% confidence, this is a cello. And that to me makes it much more interesting than just based on the pure aesthetics alone, which I think are still nice. Some people in response to this discussion say, I make art just for myself. Doesn't that disprove this theory? But I think a lot of our evolved behaviors are pleasurable for their own sake. People go on running just for exercise or for fun, even though our ancestors ran to survive for food and other survival purposes. We talk for communication. You might talk to yourself or sing in the shower. That doesn't mean that talking doesn't have an evolutionary benefit. So when could this change, given this theory? When could a computer be considered an artist? So certainly, if we reach the point of human-level AI that essentially has the same properties and consciousness of humans, then they should be able to become artists. But again, this scenario is complete science fiction. This world is so different from the one that we know today that it's so hard to even think, reason about what it would be like, and it's certainly nowhere near coming true. Now, what about social and conversational AI? We have a lot of different kinds of technologies that are social in some way, like chatbots, like Eliza and Twitter bots, Siri and Alexa and Cortana, Nekotsume and parotherapeutic seals. So these are all systems that have social-like behaviors. But in most cases, and sometimes they fool people into thinking that they're sort of intelligent in some way. But once you find out how it was built or what it is, then often you feel cheated if you thought it was really a person. And I think people really distinguish between these and real people. So I think it's possible that people could be fooled into thinking that computers are artists if they believe that there is a consciousness behind it. But I think this is unlikely as long as people are not, as long as there's honesty. And then non-social software where there's some code that you can git pull and like run this code and it produces images. I just don't see how, if you know how these things were built, that you could believe that they're artists anytime soon. But on the positive side, we have all these new technologies and there's so much going on, and new technology helps art stay vital. And conversely, art that doesn't change grows stale. And again, we've seen this again and again. Another example about how it's hard to make predictions is with the guitar. So here's Les Paul, who is the innovator of the electric solid body guitar, and he played very nice kind of show tunes and light jazz and country music. There's just no way that he could have predicted how his invention would have changed popular music over the next several decades. And I think we're at the same time now where we're already seeing just really wonderful AI artworks developed with technologies for which the people who built those technologies had no idea how people were going to use it. And I see kind of a couple of current themes in AI art. So like I said, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. And by the way, I should say that generative art is still a vibrant kind of sub-community, particularly like the work of Zach Lieberman. Just following his Instagram or Twitter is just a source of joy. He's just a wonderfully creative artist, just writing code. So one big theme we've seen today, which I'll just mention a few examples in passing, is the criticism of AI in art. Some of this criticism doesn't even involve software. For example, criticism of the way recommendation systems, like in this work, or criticism of face recognition. These are portraits that were painted of individuals in such a way that they could not be recognized by face recognition systems. There's also AI system used to criticize the social effect of AI software. ImageNet Roulette is an important example where a face classification algorithm was trained on on ImageNet, one of the popular, image labeling data sets, and there's a lot of concerns about various forms of bias that this brings up in the work. And an even more pointed example is the white collar artwork, which is a criticism of predictive policing that targets lower income communities for violent crime. This artwork is a predictor of where white collar crime is likely to occur, such as financial crimes and not paying taxes, as well as there's also a profiling prediction of the sort of likely suspects for these kinds of crimes. But now I want to spend the final part of the talk talking about the aesthetics, and particularly in GAN, or generative adversarial networks. GANs have become really popular among AI artists, and I would say anyone who's worked in the space, most of them have in some way experimented with GANs. Here's examples from Mario Klingemann, Trevor Paglen, Helena Sarin, and Sofia Crespo. And even from the beginning, people were kicking the tires. And actually, Mario Klingemann's Twitter feed is often quite interesting to follow because he's posting his experiments along the way. This is one early test he did with a GAN variant called Pix to Pix. using his own data sets. And much later, what I believe is probably an evolution of this technique, what became an installation piece, and this was auctioned, I think, at Sotheby's for $50,000. And I think there's a reason that GANs have become so popular in making artwork, and because in a way they exhibit this property called visual indeterminacy, which is much of the feeling of contemporary or modern art, and they sort of naturally produce this sort of art-like image. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Visual indeterminacy is a term coined by Robert Pepperell to describe images that at first glance suggest like they should have a very simple, clear, coherent explanation, but as you look around, it doesn't add up. So for example, this image here looks like some simple object, but you can't tell exactly what its silhouette is or what the figure ground is. And of course, as images get more complex, they become more interesting. This visual indeterminacy started showing up in the 19th century. It's existed in some form in all art, but in the 19th century, for example, Turner's work became very noticeably indeterminate. That you can probably tell it's a sunset. Maybe the title helps. And you can tell that there are objects there to be recognized, but you can't really tell what they are. And he was certainly a controversial figure. But in the modern art era, indeterminacy became very important, and ambiguity in general became a key desired value in contemporary art. So Picasso said, when looking at a picture, the more associations it can open up, the better. So like in his Cubist work here, you might see a glass. This is a still life. You might see different items on the table, but it never resolves into a coherent interpretation. And the current painter, Gerhard Richter, has said more concisely, I don't like pictures that I understand. And this is his Annunciation Painting, which, the title as he refers to Renaissance painting. And it seems like there should be something there, but it's not clear what there is. And Richter has described the perceptual process in a way. He says, we only find paintings interesting because we search for something familiar. And usually we do find those similarities, table, blanket, and so on. When we do not find anything, we are frustrated, and that keeps us excited and interested. So there's this visual perceptual process that happens where we see an image that looks like it should be coherent, and we study it, trying to figure it out, and it just never quite comes together as having a single interpretation. So having multiple associations and suggesting different things, these are really the things that are valued in modern art. Here's a painting that Robert Pepperell did, meant to specifically be indeterminate. When I first saw this, I thought GANs. I showed this to some colleagues at work, asked them how they thought it was made, and they all said neural networks. But this painting was made 15 years ago, specifically to be indeterminate. Now, one way to see the way that GANs just seem so predisposed to this is to play with this tool called ArtBreeder by Joel Simon. It's an online tool that lets you sort of remix and explore images from different GAN models. And it is so much fun. It's so cool. I highly recommend it. And it just naturally seems to produce these images that I think this is something, but I just can't tell what it is. Other images like this one really looks like an eyeglasses store, some kind of shop, but telling where objects begin or end is just impossible. And so these sort of indeterminacy properties are, I think, what we see in a lot of current GAN art. And in fact, the artists who are making art with GANs, they're kind of breaking the model. So, 20 years ago, we had data-driven algorithms that were pretty good, but they didn't have necessarily the kind of range to create high-quality images that we have now. There are some GANs, like StyleGAN FFHQ, which just one great, highly realistic face after the other. They don't have this artistic property. Whereas with the big GAN model that's used in ArtBreeder, a lot of times it makes these weird images, and those are the most interesting, most indeterminate, most artistically useful or artistically interesting images. And in fact, I suspect that as GANs get better, artists will have to break the models more and more. And in fact, in ArtBreeder is not using the GAN the way it was meant to be used because it's using invalid class embedding vectors. And Mario Klingemann's work also, he is rearranging layers and messing up the model in different ways to get some of these interesting effects. So what we're seeing here, so these are all just examples of how these new technologies, which have all been developed just within the past few years, artists are just seizing on them, experimenting and exploring them, and it's I think starting to have a cultural impact. And this process is just going to keep happening. We just can't predict how artists are going to respond to these new technologies. We can't predict, but this stuff is just going to keep happening and keep evolving in ways which I think is just super exciting to watch. So to conclude, my main points are here that new technologies, including AI software and AI in general, are tools that benefit art and artists. They provide artists with new things to experiment, new things that provoke artists' creativity, and provide new cultural products, new ways for us to communicate with each other. I believe art is effectively a social activity, which means that art is really, or at least evolutionary social activity, which means that it's really only social actors that can create art. Right now, people with whom we can have social relationships. This means that software will not be artists anytime soon. We cannot foresee a time in which AI will be really intelligent or conscious, and therefore I don't think software or AI will be artists. But amazing new AI-driven art is coming. It's already here. It's just evolving what seems daily. It's just a wonderful time to be following the art world and to be involved in this kind of software and to see what's happening next, and even to participate with it. It's actually with the development with a lot of the online communities, with people tweeting about their AI art experiments. People are able to get into this field who don't necessarily have conventional AI or conventional art backgrounds. And so it's a really wonderful time to watch and listen and participate.